Cocaine use in Europe is at an all-time high. Authorities in ports across the whole continent are seizing record quantities of controlled substances. But is Europe really losing its own war on drugs? And is it the only form of organized criminal activity that we should be concerned about? Good evening. My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View, back from our studio in Warsaw. This week, we will examine the growing threat of organized crime in Europe. Gangs, the mafia, and regular thugs have always banded together to do their dirty deeds here. That's no secret. But in recent years, we've seen a seismic shift in the landscape of criminal activity. EU countries have become the primary market for hard drugs smuggled from Latin America, thanks in part to new connections with local cartels. But the drug trade isn't the only criminal enterprise that Europe has to deal with. Sex trafficking, migrant smuggling, poaching, even the illegal trade of timber and biomass are all challenges that grow bigger by the year. So what are Europe's most notorious criminal organizations? And how has the criminal ecosystem changed over the years? We'll look for answers to these questions in our first report.
Cocaine has been a mainstay of the European crime scene for decades. But never has its use been as widespread as now. Data presented by the European Monitoring Centre for Drug and Drug Addiction is staggering. As many as 2.5 million Europeans aged 15 to 34 are addicted to coke. Altogether, nearly 10 million people in Europe consume cocaine on a regular basis. Europol, the European Joint Law Enforcement Agency, puts the value of this market between 7.6 and 10.5 billion euro. The drug originates mostly from Colombia and reaches Europe through two main routes, either shipped directly from the Pacific coast of Latin America or smuggled to ports on the Atlantic. The more stops on the way, the more hurdles to overcome. As a result, the price rises with the distance traveled. On the streets of Latin American cities, a gram of cocaine goes for just a few dollars. In Europe, the economics of the drug trade are radically different. Prices in Paris can reach up to $65 per gram, and in Copenhagen, up to $85. European authorities do what they can to combat the illicit trade, but criminals often outmaneuver them. Italian, Dutch, and Irish groups are known to have institutional links with cartels in Latin America. They study shipping routes and know the weak spots of the European customs system. Law enforcement officials, in turn, don't have the resources to check every container in Rotterdam, Dublin, or Antwerp. In result, no matter how hard it's waged, the war against organized drug trafficking seems lost.
Is Europe really using its own war on drugs? And are we helpless when confronted with organized crime groups which increasingly operate like transnational corporations? To answer all these questions, I'm joined tonight by a panel of esteemed experts in the field of organized crime. Joining me tonight are Jason Ely, senior expert at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, Jelle Janssens, associate professor at the University of Ghent, and Ivan Briscoe, senior director at the International Crisis Group. Good evening, gentlemen. And I want to begin with you, Jason, straight away and ask you to evaluate the available data on drug use and drug trafficking, especially in the context of Europe. Because in preparation for this episode, we checked numerous different data sets, and they all seem to be quite convincingly pointing us into the direction of cocaine being at an all-time high in terms of its use in Europe. So first question, is this a correct assessment? And second of all, where does this rise come from originally?
Well, I would agree with the assessment that we're seeing a marked increase in consumption. And I think a lot of this, I think there are a couple of factors behind this. You're seeing a movement away from a focus on the US, which has traditionally been the the largest export destination for cocaine, because the U.S. market has become largely saturated. And the European market itself, although there are some established countries where cocaine has been around for a long time, there's been a marked shift eastward in Europe in terms of consumption, particularly when we look at crack cocaine. And I would look to the data from the European Drug Agency, particularly their wastewater analysis data, that shows a marked increase in 2/3 of cities over the last 2 years and an 80% increase in the last 10 years. So yes, there is a big increase going on in Europe right now with coke.
But would you say that this was a gradual process, or was that a singularity, a very particular event that happened along the way that actually led into the situation that Europe is facing itself right now?
Well, I would say two things. First, the agreement that was reached in Colombia in 2016 with the FARC that saw them demobilize had, as an unintended consequence, created space for a number of other groups to come in. And in the 10 years since, we've seen a marked increase in the volume of production of cocaine in that region. So there's a lot more cocaine being produced today than there used to be. I would say also the COVID pandemic had a significant influence on the way that the availability and distribution of cocaine in Europe and other markets around the world was altered. In particular, moving from offline to online transactions, and opening up new markets and new channels for trafficking to be moving in. So I would say over the last 10 years, we've seen a steady increase in consumption, and particularly post-COVID in supply.
So Ivan, I want to turn to you and kind of follow up on what Jason was saying and ask you, what does it look like from the Latin American perspective? Is really Europe more and more attractive a market for Latin American cartels in terms of drug trafficking? And if that's the case, why has that become the dominant place of drug trafficking compared to the US, for instance?
Well, I think I agree with the previous speaker's comments. The US market for cocaine has stagnated. There is obviously an appetite in the United States for other sorts of drugs, which have increased massively in quantity, such as fentanyl, most notably, causing a huge number of fatalities in the United States. But the cocaine market in Europe has been growing. It's buoyant. Large amounts are spent on it, particularly in the big cities. And this market has been met with cocaine from Latin America because of the diversification of routes and new transport possibilities which have arisen. If you look at the original cocaine export trade, pioneered, if you like, by Pablo Escobar and the cartels of Colombia in the 1980s, it involved relatively short plane and boat rides from the Atlantic coast of Colombia up to Florida and into the United States. And these routes have changed hugely over the decades since then, obviously as a result of the pressure of security agencies and interdictions and seizures of drugs. But what we're now seeing is a huge move towards dependency on shipping containers. Contamination, as it's called, of shipping containers with cocaine has become the main route, the main form of transporting cocaine, and that's the way to get to Europe, obviously, and to the big ports of Europe, such as Hamburg, Rotterdam, and Antwerp. And that has enabled cocaine to be exported en masse.
So on that note, I want to bring you, Jelle, into that discussion, especially since you're based in Belgium, which is the critical point on the map of organized crime in Europe. What has been the response of the European law enforcement agencies to that rise of drug trafficking into Europe? Because when you look at the data, in some cases, we actually see the quantities of controlled substances being seized in different ports going down. But is it because of the fact that there are fewer shipments, or maybe we're just less and less effective at detecting them?
It's a very good question, and a good evening all. Indeed. Well, first of all, there's a warning. The year is not over yet. So perhaps if we find another container of 10 tons of cocaine, well, the figures might rise. But on the other hand, yes, we see that compared to the previous years, that the volume of confiscated cocaine in the port of Antwerp, for example, has decreased, and Rotterdam as well. And it's probably due to the fact that, first of all, indeed, as has been indicated by the previous speakers, that the routes have changed, that criminal organizations find different routes through West Africa, Sierra Leone, Spain, and other parts as well. But there could be another item as well. Perhaps the stock of cocaine has been shipped during the previous years to Europe, and now we're waiting for a new production cycle. So it could depend on markets, the market factors as well that are calculated.
Could you elaborate on the production cycle bit a little more? How long does that last? And also, one more question about the economics of that trade quickly. Is it really as much of a cash flow business as we tend to believe? How do you pay for a massive shipment of cocaine? And especially the thing I'm interested in is how long does that take to receive the payment?
Okay, that's a good question. I don't have the exact answer, but there is a heavy...
I don't think anybody has, for that matter.
No, indeed. But what we see, and that's perhaps also a gap in our knowledge and law enforcement activities, that we tend to focus on what comes into the country or what comes into Europe, but we're not very focused on what goes out to Latin America. So we know that hidden compartments in cars are being used to smuggle out cash, etc., but also bitcoins are being used, and this cryptocurrency banking systems that have been developed in several Latin American countries seem to be very influential as well in dealing with these cash flows. And yes, it's very lucrative. It's very lucrative because risks are being taken. And if you then consider the production cycle, it does take a lot of investments to come up from the farmers until the retail sector. It takes some time. And so the assumption might be as well that the reason for the drop in cocaine is not because there's not demand, but perhaps there's some production issues.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your comments and expertise on drug trafficking. But we all know that drugs are not the only way criminal organizations make their money. So let's find out how else transnational criminal groups are actually diversifying their profits. It is no secret that in order to be successful in business, you need to limit your exposure to risk. One of the best ways to do that is to diversify sources of your profits. And that's exactly what transnational criminal organizations have been doing for decades. Human trafficking, crypto scamming, tax evasion, criminals can do it all, often at the same time. We examine their sophisticated business model in our next report.
While drug smuggling remains the most common and most profitable activity for organized crime, other revenue sources are gaining traction. More and more organizations are getting into human trafficking, benefiting from increased migration pressure. According to the International Organization for Migration, every year 120,000 people are trafficked to Europe through the Balkans alone. Only a fraction of those break free and are able to report to law enforcement. Around 2/3 of them are females, almost always trafficked for forced sexual work. The United Nations estimate that European criminals earn over €2.5 billion per year on human trafficking. Another profitable area of activity is cybercrime, but here the damage and market values are way more difficult to estimate. Victims often don't report crimes they've fallen prey to, if they even notice them in the first place. The currency of cybercrime is not always hard money, but data. Information that is stolen, passed on to hostile powers, or simply sold to the highest bidder on the dark net. Criminals steal industrial secrets or sensitive government information or threaten to disrupt public transportation. Nothing is off limits for them, and they are truly globalized actors. They frequently offshore parts of their operations to countries with lax legal systems and no extradition treaties with Europe. But their foot soldiers remain active here, with the gang's leadership remaining in the country of origin. The largest organizations trade in everything, from humans to endangered animals, from synthetic drugs to intelligence dossiers. There are no longer a local entity, so to shut them down, law enforcement agencies also need to go global.
Ivan, I want to ask you about precisely the topic that we prepared our second report on, the diversification of the sources of income. We know that drugs are by far the most profitable items in the portfolio, so to speak, of organized crime groups. But what are the other most important sources of income? Is there perhaps a second most important category? And kind of a follow-up question to this, do we have groups that really specialize in one particular craft of organized crime, or do we have actors just do it all?
I mean, obviously, drugs would still represent the main criminal revenue source, and there are a host of others. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, and also it would depend on the region. But human trafficking, extortion, illegal logging, illegal mining, the list goes on. But I think we have to add an important element to that report. Criminal groups have diversified, there's no doubt about it, but criminal groups have actually fragmented as well. We're not seeing the same large-scale, dominant criminal groups which just carry out a host of different criminal activities. There are actually lots of different parts of criminal groups. If you look at the drug trafficking, a chain, if you like, going from Latin America into Europe, it involves financiers, it involves international traffickers, it involves national groups like the Gaitanistas in Colombia, it involves local gangs who are often the ones carrying out the largest acts of violence within those countries, the mass murders which take place in countries like Ecuador. So, I mean, this is the new map of crime around the world. And obviously, this gives resilience as well, because you can't, if you take out one organization, another organization will almost certainly take its place. If you take out one scam or source of activity, or if you clamp down on drugs or remove one sort of drug supply chain or human trafficking, another will emerge. So these all add to the resilience of criminal organizations, but it's not as simple as it used to be. There are not these big dominant groups carrying out these large-scale crimes. It's actually become much more of an ecosystem which unites different regions.
So we're going to talk about the globalization of organized crime in a minute, but I want to first turn to you, Jelle, and ask about the European response to that diversification, and in particular one that would touch upon the migrant crisis, because we know that in the face of increased migrant pressure, we have increased criminal activity due to migrant trafficking, migrant smuggling. And do we have verifiable data on how migration pressure actually translated into the boom of organized crime in Europe? And again, kind of similar question to the previous one, are those the same actors that traffic humans and drugs, or perhaps drugs by means of humans, into Europe at the same time?
Well, it's very clear that there's some sort of portfolio management, that criminal organizations, networks use smuggling routes to traffic different kinds of goods, and including humans as well. What we know from police data and police interviews is that migrants are very often recruited to deal drugs, but also they sell drugs to migrants, and they're in a very dire, particular fragile situation. So they're very often being exploited, and we see reports coming out that children, minors, are being smuggled or trafficked into Europe as well to start dealing drugs, and they're mass raped and all. It's horrendous images that we see and hear of. So yes, on the one hand, we see that there's a connection between human trafficking and drugs, but human trafficking also has its own purpose and also profitability. Because drugs, if you compare, and if I may, we did a research on the profitability of human trafficking. And that ranges, if you look at an annual revenue, human trafficking might go up as 380,000 euros a year. If you look at one cannabis plantation, it goes up 5 years per year, 80 million euros. And if you look at synthetic drugs, that's 144 million euros. So drugs is the big game changer here. But you're right, migration is a big problem in Europe, and especially for law enforcement authorities to deal with.
So, Jason, a question about the European legal power in a global perspective. Do we as Europeans, or let's say broadly speaking, the Western liberal democracies, have enough leverage to actually control organized crime in an international perspective. And I'm asking in particular about jurisdiction or diplomatic relations with places like Dubai, Hong Kong, Panama City, places that don't really recognize any sort of international framework of legality, so to speak. Do we have enough leverage to actually ask for extradition treaties or perhaps even run joint investigations with other actors outside Europe?
Well, I think certainly we have the capacity. The challenge, however, is that the majority of the world, so if we look at the capacity of judicial systems and law enforcement bodies around the world outside of Europe, you're seeing agencies and institutions that are extremely wanting in terms of their abilities. That's not to say they don't have the desire and the will to pursue cooperation and cooperative initiatives. It's that they lack completely the capacity to do basic surveillance, et cetera, that's necessary here. And you add to that the challenges around jurisdiction that you raised. I mean, jurisdiction is something that has held back law enforcement for quite a long time because, of course, organized criminal groups don't have to worry about international boundaries and borders. They live in a borderless world. But to pursue them, particularly outside of Europe, requires a great deal of political nuance, agreements, as you said, and a lot of quid pro quo between nations as well. So we're talking about the politics of drugs that go well beyond just law enforcement itself.
Mm-hmm. And Ivan, to conclude and kind of to come back to some of your earlier points, I wanted to ask about technological developments. How important is the technology, AI, social media, in the development of international crime? And we saw that in particular in recent weeks with the arrest of Pavel Dubov, the founder of Telegram. Some criminal organizations got very nervous about the fact that there might be some increased moderation on some parts of Telegram. Is this really that important of a medium for them?
I don't think social media plays a certain role. Obviously, WhatsApp and other encrypted apps are extremely important for communication. Immediate communication is essential for enabling different, smaller, boutique criminal groups to coordinate their activities, which is exactly what I was saying earlier about the expansion of criminal activity. And that's vital. It also enables a criminal group in its homeland or its sort of bastion, if you like, whether in Latin America or Southeast Asia, to communicate with citizens and ensure that its dictates and its rules are obeyed. And we see that has become increasingly common, especially in the years since the pandemic, when groups, whether in the parts of the Amazon or in Colombia or in Ecuador, needed to establish strong home bases. So media does play a role. But at the same time, these are organizations which depend fundamentally on bonds of human trust. Because there is no supreme authority which can establish the law in the underworld or in criminal activity. And so I think in some ways there does remain that important non-technological aspect of crime, which is essential for oiling their operations as well.
So we see increased globalization, we see more and more connections, but very quickly, kind of in one sentence, if you could, is it the right position to assume right now that we have more institutionalized or institution-like connections between European and Latin American and other international organizations in the world of crime?
They have been building them up. The European Union and individual European states have seen the extreme importance of building up stronger relationships with police forces. I use the example of Latin America again. We've seen trips by very senior officials over to the countries where cocaine is being exported to try and build those relations. But it's very difficult. Security, internal domestic security is still viewed as something which is the preserve of the nation state. And unfortunately, when international, transnational operations take place, it's very important to also protect against leakage of information. So intelligence services are not always that willing to share essential information between one service and another. All these different obstacles get in the way. The idea of an international body pooling information to carry out pursuit of criminals who cross borders and go from one place to one other to wherever they are safest and best protected is extremely difficult. It's an ideal. It has not been realized yet.
Maybe we'll get there one day. Extremely complex web of connections, a lot to unpack here. Jason Eli, Jelle Janssens, Ivan Briscoe, thank you very much. As with many problems that Europe faces right now, the answer seems to be more cooperation. Just like with migration, climate change, or Russian propaganda, no country will be able to deal with organized crime on its own. Authorities need to share resources and information, just like criminals do. They have learned to profit from it, and it's high time European countries do as well. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we'll dive into the bizarre and interesting world of political lobbying. Make sure you tune in next Thursday, and have a good evening.